In conversation with Judith Jackson-Pomeroy, a professor of gender studies and sociology for over 20 years, Judith Jackson-Pomeroy retired academic regalia to write women's fiction. When she's not writing, she earned a keep working as an acquisition editor for an academic press and research collaborator at the Justice and Gender-Based Violence Research Initiative of Wellesley Center for Women, Wellesley College. A fiction is described as a take on modern womanhood with theme of sexual politics, mental health, and addiction that pushes back with humor on the redemptive narrative trope and features tartly funny, unapologetic, complex female protagonists who will make you laugh, facepalm, and cry. This is a debut. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure, joy, and excitement to offer the show today Judith Jackson-Pomeroy. How are you doing,
I'm
Judith?
great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Cindy, for having me on. I'm good. How are you guys?
Like, we're doing great, and it's nice to meet you.
You too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite lovely to have you on the show today. Quite lovely having read through some of your work on Amazon. I'm quite excited we are here to sit and talk about it. So thank you very much for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So, Judith, I need to first say that I am taken aback by the description page of your book, Weight of a Woman, whom I found the description of it to be quite amazing, quite lovely, quite awesome, and it's just so compelling and quite captivating to me, and even the title of the book on itself. And I would like to ask you as to how this book came to be, what inspired you to write this book and tell this story?
Yeah, I mean, it really has grown out of my background as a gender studies professor.
Mm,
Um, my whole professional life has been sort of seeing the world through a gender lens. I was doing that through research and facts for 20 years as a professor, but I wanted to really reach a different audience.
mm.
A novel is a very different audience than an academic audience.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to emphasize how gender shapes our lives. It has long-term, profound, lifelong consequences.
Mm,
And I really wanted to do that in a fictional way. And, as a professor, I was, always spewing facts at my students about women are more likely to have mental health issues than men, and
mm,
women are more likely to be homeless than men, and all of these things. But on a daily basis with my students, I was seeing the individual consequences, not just
mm.
the unequal pay for women as a whole group and things like that. And so I wanted to tell that story.
Yeah.
I'd have individual students coming to me, telling me about their problems that grew out of their gendered experience. That's what led me to fictionalize it.
Sounds like you've done quite a bit in this fiction book that you've got going there. What might have been some of the themes that you might have crossed or so forth that you could share with us?
Mhm.
Expand on your book a little bit.
So Cindy, I mean, it hints at it in different ways in the description,
Mm,
but the story really has themes, right, of sexual assault, addiction,
mm,
hypersexuality, self-harm, which are really, really heavy topics, but that's woven into a gendered experience.
mm,
And some really big overarching themes that always comes up in my fiction work is sort of cloistered worlds. Like we don't know about professors' lives.
mm.
Those are sort of hidden, just like we don't know about celebrities' lives. They're hidden. We
Yeah,
only hear about them in very abstract ways. And
absolutely.
so I really like to use that as a theme in all of my work, in all of my
Mm,
fiction. And so there's these two cloistered worlds, professor and rock star, which you would never put together, right? But also, I wanted to very much tell a story that really gets at the heart of all of the struggles involved in being feminine.
Wow.
And specifically, I'm telling it from my perspective. I am a white, straight woman living in the United States, but I grew up in Britain, so it's got all of these things woven into it.
That's quite amazing to know, really, because today I was actually reading the book about sexual survivors this morning, and some of the things you
Mhm.
mentioned kind of, come to my head, like, oh yeah, I remember reading about this in the morning. The book is quite here with me. Very beautiful and quite lovely to know. Thank you very much for sharing. And Judith, you spent 20 years as a gender studies professor before transitioning to writing women's fiction. I wanted to ask you, what was that shift like for you, and what made you decide to take your expertise in a new direction? I'm curious.
Well, it was really a situation that happened, really. Like I said when I started off, my whole life has been about my job as a gender studies professor has been more than a job. It's been a vocation for me. It is my life
Mm,
calling
I love
to
that.
talk, to understand gender, to explain it.
Mm,
And I was doing that, and I would have continued doing that if this circumstance hadn't happened that transitioned me to fiction. And
mm,
that circumstance was I had a baby, and that baby, who is now an adult, it really, really struggled extremely with separation anxiety.
mm,
And I had a choice, I could and I was lucky. I was privileged enough to have a choice where I had a partner who could support me at
yeah.
home. So I made the decision to stay home with my child, for a period of time. But the need to be in the world of gender was still there. And so I started writing fiction about gendered lives, gendered experiences. One thing that was really interesting to me is in all of this process, I was also trying to find my birth father.
Mm,
And, as a sociologist, sociologists really believe that, we are nature. There's very little about us that's nurture. We're a
Mhm.
product of our circumstances and who raised us and where we were raised and the experiences we had, and very little to do with genetics. So it was funny for me because I found my birth father, and it turned out that we'd had almost identical lives.
mm,
He was a writer. He was very political, like extremely. That was like his calling, as I've always been. And it was just really interesting to me. I was like, oh, this makes sense. I guess this is in my DNA.
mm,
So that was also unsettling for me, though, because as a sociologist, I didn't believe in that. So it was unsettling to discover that might be something after all to this nature business. So,
mm.
It's interesting that you say that because I do believe there is something to that nature bit. I'm a twin,
oh, yeah.
and we
Wow.
find that we could be like months without talking, and then we've
Mm,
crossed similar paths and stuff. And I've seen that amongst other people,
Yeah.
um,
yeah.
twins that have been separated and led very similar lives. So it's interesting that you bring that into
Yeah.
the topic today.
Yeah.
Now, through some of my understanding and research, your book, your writing is very satirical, and there's a lot of snarky humor,
Mhm.
and it's kind of you take this approach, it's kind of odd humor to talk about the very heavy topics that
Mm,
you
Yeah.
actually write about. And I mean, we're talking like with this weight of woman, the sexual assault, the sexual harm, the addictions, and the promiscuity. What made you take the humorous approach
Mhm.
rather than the sober and serious approach
Yep.
that most people would expect,
Mhm.
an author would write about and stuff like that? Could you share with me your
Yeah.
insight?
Yeah. I really appreciate that question because it's not something you would expect, right? And some readers have reacted to it quite strongly, like, oh my God, you
wow.
know. But yeah, I did so very going into this knowing I would do that. I come from a unique perspective in writing this story because I'm a survivor myself. And so I felt like I was coming from this unique place to tell a story about surviving sexual assault. And I'm only telling, so I'm telling it from this very satirical perspective, mostly because when I have read fiction that has this very redemptive narrative, like sort of this horrible thing happened to this person, it was awful, they struggled, and then all of a sudden everything was wonderful and they had a happy ever after. And I didn't want to tell that story about sexual assault, based on not just my own experience, but working with survivors through research that I've done. I was like, that really doesn't capture it. And that's not the story I want to tell. So, yeah, this terrible, terrible thing happens to this character, Sarah, who would take issue, Cindy, with you calling it promiscuity. Sarah, the character in the book, calls it hypersexuality. So that's meant to be funny too. I wanted a non-redemptive story to be told, like there, without giving too much away, not having this perfect ride. Life is messy. Life is sometimes horrible and tragic.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it can also be ludicrously funny, and those things can happen at the same time.
Yeah.
And this character is showing how that happens to her. She's got these horrible, horrible things happening, but there's still joy in her life. And sometimes there's very little joy, and sometimes it's just very bleak. And then other times it's just pure joy. So I wanted to do that. I'm not giving anything away by saying this, I don't think, because one reader had said to me I had spoken with this reader, and she had said to me, I'm so glad there was a happy ever after. And I looked at her and I said, oh, that's so interesting. I didn't see the ending that way. And yet, so it's all about interpretation, right? And so some people read this and again, it depends on your position and your experience, and they take something very different. Like they enjoy the humor. Other people find the humor a little inappropriate. And I found that really interesting. Yeah.
But we survive because of our humor. And my background in recreational therapy, working with people with chemical dependency and geriatric psych all over the board, I can tell you, you got to be able to laugh in the midst of the hardest moments. Otherwise, you don't survive life. So I support you on writing a book that is different and not the romantic conclusion or the happy ever conclusion. But like that person that you're talking about, there was a conclusion because there evidently was, because they felt as a satisfied reader.
Yeah.
And so that's important. You gave that satisfaction to that reader.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And even myself, most of the books I've read recently are striking memoirs. Memoirs are very saddening, quite tearful. The ones that very evocative and could even leave you crying right on the page. But then I find it very unbelievable when the author still utilizes humor. And even in some most dreadful situation, dreadful narration, the most saddest scenarios, there's still humor in it. And I'll be like, you're telling a very striking story and you're still making a joke out of it. How do you do that? It's always very surprising and very, I think it's a fun approach, really. I remember asking someone who was writing about HIV/AIDS. Him living with HIV/AIDS, etc., so many things. And he's still making a joke around the whole thing. And I was like, what's your approach? Why do you have to do that? Do you want us to laugh as a reader? Are you trying to relieve us from the emotion you've left us with reading your memoir or something? I just find it a very lovely approach, really.
Yeah, I actually think though too. Sometimes it's a technique, right? That the writer is using. but also, which is what you're curious about, Peter, but I also think people that are writing about an experience that's actually happened to them, or an illness that they've had, you can write about it from all of those perspectives because you've had all of those experiences.
Mhm.
But I mean, with my story, it's complete fiction. But still, you can't help as a writer bring in your own experiences and how you transformed those experiences to survive.
Mhm.
When I was seeing reviews of the book, and when I was reading survivors' reviews of the book, they made me cry
See.
because I wasn't expecting survivors to be they felt so hurt.
Mm.
And yet, some survivors found it too heavy. So yeah, it's really, I mean, it's very interesting how people come to a story. They bring so much to a story that they read, right? And that's going to shape what they take away
Mhm.
completely.
That's quite lovely, really. And I think it's a beautiful, and fun approach, really. I love
Mm,
that. I love
mm,
that. And I also wanted to ask you one question pop up in my head while you were talking. I wanted to ask you, you've been a professor of gender studies for over 20 years, and I wanted to ask you, how did your profession as a professor influence the making of this book? How does it influence the storytelling? How does it influence the characterization? How does it
mm.
influence if you have to, decide to make this a fiction or a non-fiction? How does it
Yeah,
influence the making of the book entirely? I love your take
yeah.
on that.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that the answer to that is both completely it influenced it and then absolutely not at all. Um, so contradictory. And what I mean by that is my studies of
Mm,
gender over so many decades um, are in these pages.
mm,
But the writing is completely non-academic.
mm,
I mean, there are times when the character in the book is lecturing and sort of, that's when I wrote that, I meant it to be funny, like sort of eye rolling. It's like, oh, for goodness sake, who wants to listen to somebody give them a lecture on gender theory when you're out at
yeah.
I mean, it's like that's the last thing you're ready to hear.
Mm,
So the life of an academic and the stories we tell as academics in the classroom and the books we write as academics and the papers that we write are done very objectively and at a distance, whereas fiction is a completely different way of writing. So it had nothing to do. The
well,
writing style is completely brand new for me. Of
mm,
course, I've been writing fiction for 20 years though, so it's not new for me anymore. But I still have a foot in academia, so I still straddle this divide between fiction writing and academic writing. And in my work at Wellesley, I hope brought that as a strength to the writing I'm doing there,
mm,
because one of the books I'm working on right now with one of the people at the Justice and Gender-Based Violence Research Initiative
mm,
um, is trying to do something different with the book and sort of not fully academic. There's still some academic in there, but not fully. And so I think I've brought that fiction writing experience to that.
mm,
So it's sort of a narrative nonfiction, if you will.
mm,
And so yeah, the writing style is very different. I am much more comfortable writing fiction, and I think that's just part of my personality. I'm
mm,
sociable, um, person who, enjoys talking with people. I find people interesting, and
interesting.
and so I'm always paying attention to people as characters
Mm,
that often end up in my book. books and fiction, especially if they really piss me off or I really like them. It's always one extreme or the other. You're going to end up getting fictionalized.
So we could get written into your book, right?
Sorry, so yeah, but
we could get written into your book.
Glowing characters.
Oh my
Yeah.
Oh
goodness.
my good.
That was quite fun.
This brings me to my question. I've got 3 questions. I'm like, I got to get them off my mind because I'm dying to ask them. Okay, so I want to know, 1, what's your inspiration to write? 2, do you have a certain writing process? Because like I know I personally have a writing process. I know Peter does too. But then when you are writing, do you start with the plot, the characters? Does it grow from there? Does it grow from a seed? Where do you get your ideas? Where do you get your inspiration? And please make sure that Peter and I are written in your book with glowing reviews. But
Yeah, there will be a podcast in my next book, and
Interesting.
will be yeah, I love that question, Cindy. I always start with character, and so my books are character driven, and plot comes along after the character develops. What I do, I've been lucky enough to know a lot of very interesting people. So somebody is, having an experience, a friend of mine, I'll say, for example, having an experience that I'm thinking, boy, how does she get through the day with that? She's so incredibly brilliant and smarter than almost, probably the smartest person I've ever known.
Wow.
And she is doing a job that she hates, and how does she get through the day? So I'll take and this is all of my writing is really based on a kernel of truth of someone I know, and then it spins out from there, becomes a whole other person. But it starts with a character a person I know.
Wow.
And from that, I put them in an interesting place. And that's what I did with Sarah in Weight of a Woman. Sarah, I know what it's like to be a professor. I know what that life looks like. But wouldn't it be interesting if Sarah were in a completely new situation, like at a rock concert? And so I take the characters, these interesting people, and put them in a new situation. But one thing I do is I really live these characters' lives for a good. When I'm writing a book about, like Sarah, not all the time, because it's going to make me sound crazy now, I thought about what Sarah would do several times a day in different situations.
Wow.
So that she became more and more fully fleshed out for me.
Wow.
And so, for example, I would be buying bread and I would stand there and say, I wonder what Sarah would buy. I really got that much into each of the characters' minds. And that was a technique I had been taught to in writing, workshops. And so then I would have a profile of each character. For this book, every character had pages and pages and pages of character notes about who they were, where they were born, who their parents were, things that never ended up in the book, because I wanted them to feel fully real. And they became real for me, to the point where one day Marco is a character in the book, who is one of Sarah's best friends. And one day I came home I picked my daughter up from school, and we came home, and she was chatting away, and I was putting groceries away or something, and she said to me, "How's Marco today?" Because she had started to think of Marco as a real person, and she was a child, so she was used to hearing stories. Not that I obviously shared any of this story with her when she was a child, but so I do a lot of character development, and
Mm.
I often start piecing pieces together. Really, the character becomes a collage. And that might sound like, well, um, I was going to say it might sound like, well, how does the person feel fully whole? But I've taken pieces from lots of different people to create Sarah.
Mm.
The next thing I did, once I had the character there, is I have an outline of the story. And that will be, so they're in this situation. This professor has a rock star student who is enamored with her, right? And how does this play out? And because I know Sarah so well from her character profile, and I know Seth so well, the person, the rock star, I know how they're going to respond in certain situations.
Mm.
And I do have a beginning, a middle, and end
Wow.
to the outline. But I will say this book, the beginning, middle, and end, was completely different when I finished it. It had a completely different ending than I intended when I set out. And that's because it didn't feel right that
Mm.
Sarah would make those decisions or that Seth would make those decisions, given everything I knew about them.
Wow.
And I did that for the four main characters in the book. Sarah, of course, is the protagonist, but yeah, so it's quite a process. And then, of course, working with beta readers, I had three amazing beta readers for this book.
Wow.
They read it so carefully and thoughtfully, every chapter, chapter by chapter, and it was really helpful
Wow.
in pulling it together. So, and then, of course, once you've written it, you've got to get a great editor who can say to you, because as you both know, as writers, sometimes that was a hard lesson for me.
Yeah.
Sometimes things don't belong in a book.
Mhm.
And that was hard for me. I had two brilliant editors on this book at different stages. One was a developmental editor, and one picked it up closer
Yeah.
to the end. And they said to me, "This has to go." And I was like, "But I love this piece." And they were like, "It doesn't work for the story. Every single word has to count, right? When you're writing fiction or especially poetry, in your case, Peter. So, every single word has to be there for a reason.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so it's quite a process. And I will say, one of my favorite things to do is to listen to interviews with my favorite authors talking
Oh.
about their process. I just,
Oh.
I seek those out all over the place.
I like to listen to other people's interviews too, and how,
Myself too. I do that a
yeah.
lot.
Yeah,
Well, it's
I think it
inspiring.
helps to help even. Yeah, you learn from it too.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, like some of my favorite authors, written 15, 16 novels, and I'm like, they must know something. And also sometimes I read their books over and over again. The first two or three times is just for the story, the way
Mm.
they craft things. And then the third and fourth and fifth time is for style and process.
Mhm.
And I'm sure all writers do this, but
Absolutely.
I love reading for the pure joy of it, and then also the craft,
Mm.
reading how they put this story together, and it's
It's
fascinating.
interesting how each genre almost has their own little way and formula
Yeah.
of doing things, like
Yeah,
romance and stuff,
yeah,
and what
absolutely.
works in that particular craft.
Genre.
Yeah,
Yeah,
genre. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I was once, I was at a conference, a writing conference in New York, and I was meeting with agents and editors.
Yeah.
So I had all these meetings set up at this conference, and it was so interesting to me. One of it really is pigeonholing, and I have an enormous amount of respect for agents, literary agents, and editors. Their
Wow.
passion for writing, it is just so. Um,
Amazing.
it really is phenomenal, and they know
Yeah,
what's needed in a book.
absolutely.
But they're the ones that kill your darlings, right? They're the ones that say this
Yeah.
needs to go and this needs to go, but they know what they're doing. So I had a couple of agents say different things to me. One said, this ending you have here, she said to me, this will not get any ranking in women's fiction if you keep that ending.
Wow.
If you want this to be a romance book, then you need this ending. Or it will not get into that genre. And I was like, well, I don't want to do that. And she was like, then you are not a romance writer.
Wow.
And I mean, I always have suspenseful romance in all of my work,
Mm.
but you have to fit into these endings to fit into a genre.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of sad that that's the business of book selling, but it is, I mean, readers need to know what they're getting, I guess. So,
That's a
Mhm.
lovely one, really. I love your take
mm.
on that. I love your take on that. And now, just apart from Weight of Woman, do you have any other works you've authored or say
Yeah,
currently working on? And also, what are
yeah,
you trying to achieve with your writing? Would I say, is it to transform experiences you've had in the past and learn from them, etc.? I'm not quite sure. I'm just, making something
yeah,
up in my head.
yeah, yeah. Oh, I really appreciate that question. I'm glad you asked it because I I think just to respond to what you asked last,
Yeah.
Peter, for me, I don't like reading things that aren't transforming somebody's experience so that I can learn from it. And
Mm,
I don't like writing things that aren't doing that too.
mm,
So everything, in Weight of a Woman is trying to learn something about an experience. And sometimes it's therapeutic, right? To write about an experience
Mhm.
yeah.
to its end. Sometimes not in a good way. Sometimes it can be in a painful way, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely love reading books that are transforming an experience for a writer because I think
Mm,
as human beings, we can all, I mean, none of us have had totally unique experiences. All of our experiences based on, right, our places in the world, like our
mm,
race, our gender, our
yeah.
age, our relative wealth or poverty. And
Mm,
so we all have the same experiences as human beings, but the way we respond to things that happen are reflected in our intersectional positions in the world. And so I find that beautiful when I'm reading, and I try to do that. I mean, I can only write from a white, straight woman's perspective. That's all I can
mm,
do. But I really appreciate uh, when somebody's honest and truthful about that. This is the
yeah.
experience I'm speaking from.
Yeah.
For example, there's a gay character in my book, and I had some sensitivity readers because I'm not gay, because I'm not a man. I had some people read it who are gay and male, and let me know how they felt about this character. And so that was really informative too. I think I've forgotten the first part of your question, Peter, and I liked it.
Yeah,
So
what think you've answered that? What are you trying to achieve? The other one is about,
yeah,
apart from Weight of
yeah,
Woman, do you have another
yeah.
works you've authored or currently working on?
Yeah, that was right. That was the other great part. Yeah, I have another book finished,
Oh,
and working with an editor on that.
interesting.
Uh, Again, this character is extremely different to Sarah. With those characters, Sarah is this super successful person. She
Wow.
becomes a thought leader. This other character is the opposite. She is really struggling, has a bookstore, is
Mm,
writing feminist sci-fi fantasy books in her
wow.
spare time. And just struggling to get by. And Sarah has a cameo in the book. Sarah is this character's the book is that the character is Kate.
Mm,
And Sarah from Weight of a Woman is her feminist guru. So she reads everything Sarah writes. And so she's in a very different position to Sarah. And so I was exploring something there, about her positionality in the world. But I also do continue to publish and write in somewhat academic circles. Like I published a Me Too paper a few years ago, a couple of years ago now, with some people from Wellesley that I'm really still wanting to do that kind of work. And I have a blog where I write
Oh,
about gender.
it's
So
amazing to know.
keep it going. Yeah.
I'm curious, in the process of everything that you've done, have you encountered like any publishing issues? Can you also share with us like the process that you've gone through with publishing your books?
Yeah. Very painful,
Wow.
as you both know yourself. It took me years to find someone to pick up Weight of a Woman, but I worked with some amazing agents, literary agents that kept encouraging me and was so incredibly supportive.
Wow.
But I feel like you got to have really, really thick skin, because you are going to get rejected over and over and over
Yeah.
and over again. And the one thing to help with that rejection, in my experience, has been to belong to a really strong writing community.
Yeah.
Also so honest beta readers. And also I've, built up a little posse, people in the profession who really give me honest feedback, and they're in the business of book publishing, and I really respect and appreciate their words. But I have found, the community of writers to be so generous and caring, and, right from the tippity top New York Times bestsellers, who've incredibly warm and generous and willing to give you the time of day, down to somebody who just picked up the idea that they want to be a writer yesterday. And I have loved being in that community. NaNoWriMo, I don't know if
Yeah.
the two of you.
NaNoWriMo, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I have just found that such a joy. I actually
Wow.
drafted Weight of a Woman at
Oh,
NaNoWriMo
wow.
12 years ago. Yeah, the whole thing. And so I really think having a good community, some people in the profession, agents especially, that like your writing and
Wow.
will keep checking in with you. And so it's all about community and just persistence. I got so sick and tired of people telling me that, like, just keep at it, don't stop writing. I really did not like that piece of advice. But one agent said to me, and I really took it to heart. This agent said to me that if you've written something that is effective, someone will pick it up. A publisher will eventually find it. But you have to keep at it. You have to keep going, and I found that very challenging. But yeah, the writing community has been enormously helpful. I will say the one thing I have found really challenging since I published the book is promoting the book.
Yeah.
I don't do that easily. Right. I don't think most artists do. Right. We don't want to sell our work. We just want to work. So we just want to keep writing or painting, but you have to. And so asking people, begging people to read the Ark, for example, and all of that is tough. It's a tough business, right?
Yeah.
It is definitely a tough business, but I find it very rewarding. And you learn a lot from it, so.
Absolutely. About yourself.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that's definitely the truth.
Yeah. And just in case we have some viewers who are watching this interview I would love to get a copy of your book. But before I go on with that, actually, I would like you to show the book to the camera while you
Yeah,
talk about the purchase platform that interested
yeah,
viewers can get a book from. Beautiful
yeah.
cover you've got in there. Weight of a Woman.
Yeah,
Lovely
I like that
glasses
one
and
too.
nice
Yeah,
lipstick.
yeah. It's really captures a lot, and you
Yeah.
can see in her glasses the themes that are in the book: books and wine. A lot of books and a
Mm,
lot of wine. It's so gratifying, right, to have it out in the world. To have your work in the world. I think one of the most wonderful and surprising things has been how readers respond to it. I've been so surprised by how people have received it. Like
wow.
some people have not taken away from it what I
Mm,
intended.
mm,
And that's fine. You had said once, Peter, that people bring different opinions to a
yeah.
book, so they're going to interpret differently. But I
Yeah.
think it's more than opinions; it's experiences, right?
Yeah.
You bring the weight of your experience
Mm,
to everything, especially when you're reading or watching something, visual. And and that's why I've been so touched by survivors that have read the book and reviewed it. And then some people have said things like, "Oh, I'm glad this didn't have a happy ever after ending." And then others have said, "I'm glad this did have a happy ever after ending." And I'm like, how could you have a completely different
different.
understanding? But it's so interesting.
Yeah.
And I had one person say, for example, "Oh, I wish there was more music in it," and another
Oh,
person said, "Oh,
wow.
I wish the music wasn't in it at all."
Oh,
So
wow.
it's because, right, it's what they are bringing to the book,
Yeah.
and what interests them the most is a reflection of their own situation in life, and what they're bringing to their reading. So, and I find that really lovely, and I did not expect that. So that's been a really nice part about publishing it.
That's lovely, really. Quite amazing. Yeah, on what platform can interested viewers get a book from?
It's pretty much available everywhere. You can get it at Amazon, you can get it at any independent bookshop, which I really like to support. But it's also available at the big box retailers like Target and, like the department stores, but also the big box booksellers too, like Barnes and Noble,
Mhm.
Mm.
to Stones in England. So yeah, pretty much anywhere. I really love to engage with readers, and I want to respond to people that want to chat about it.
We've definitely enjoyed chatting about it, haven't we?
We
I have
have.
too. I've really enjoyed chatting with you guys.
Absolutely. And I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Judith Jackson book directly on Amazon and Barnes& and Nobles on our website and also on other platforms. I also left a link to our social media pages for possible followings. So thank you so much, Judith, for accepting the invitation to be featured in P English Literature. And mostly this is more than awesome. Very great, lovely and exciting, quite, animated, quite energetic as well, having a conversation around your beautiful titles. Thank you so much for coming
Thank
on.
you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Cindy. It's been such a pleasure.